So first of all, hi, my name is JJ Asghar. I'm a developer advocate, which I have no idea what that means for IBM Cloud. I really do have the email address of awesome@ibm.com. So if you know anything about IBM, that is an impressive thing to get make happen. We're famous for atrocious emails. And you can find me at JJ Asghar more or less anywhere, which is always good. So we're here for migrating monolith to cloud native and the stumbling blocks you don't know about. And these are going to be some stories of what I've actually seen working as a developer advocate, trying to get people to move to cloud native. So hopefully you'll learn some stuff. And if you have any questions or thoughts, don't hesitate to raise your hand while I'm presenting. I'm also a streamer. So, you know, I'm used to pivoting my conversation from let's talk about Kubernetes to what is a computer very quickly. So your company has finally decided to move to the cloud native ecosystem. You've landed on containerization as your first step. You heard that all you needed to do was containerize your application and then push to Kubernetes or OpenShift or Nomad, and the cost savings will just come. Well, you've done this, and things just haven't gone as planned. Some of the tech didn't do what you were expecting. And wait, what do you mean your OpEx has just gone up? Simply said, the promise of containerization or migrating to the cloud native ecosystem can be a lie if you don't do your homework. Sadly, most companies don't. And in this talk, I'll explain a few gotchas that a few enterprises in the guise of AsgharLabs hit moving towards the cloud native world. And hopefully you'll learn from their mistakes. So when you take your trip down this path, you'll be more comfortable and be closer to that promise. So what is AsgharLabs? AsgharLabs is a multinational corporation. Tech conglomerate bought hard into the VM ecosystem. They make ones and zeros like no other company, but have noticed them falling behind. In all seriousness, AsgharLabs is a collection of different companies that have seen the same stories over and over and over again. And yes, it's a fake company. And no, I'm going to do my best not to actually say the names of those companies, because I know this is recorded. So what did AsgharLabs think they needed to do? They thought they could just take their migration from the physical data center or co-location to the VM ecosystem and use the exact same technique to move from their monolithic applications to cloud native. Bare metal to VMs is the same as VMs to containers, right? Nobody's shaking their head. This is not a good sign. It's not. So where do I come into this conversation? I come in when AsgharLabs, when they've had a few successful migrations, which honestly I beg to differ, and they're nowhere near where they thought they could be for the amount of time and effort and money that they've spent. I come in as the cloud native person and ask some very simple yet tough questions. So let's ask those straightforward questions together right now. But you'll find out very quickly they're deceptively hard to answer. Nothing popped up on my screen? Good. I had a little pop-up on my screen here, and I'm like, oh no. If anything embarrassing pops up during this presentation, I apologize ahead of time. I swear I turned off Slack. First question. Who containerized your app? Was it the developers or the automation team? Or sorry, the developers or operations team? Was there more than a couple status meetings, AsgharLabs, between that project team and when y'all shipped it? And yes, I say y'all. You'd be amazed on how many people don't actually know. When they start talking to one another and they start trying to move, and you're running this app up on some Kubernetes cluster. Who containerized it? They're like, oh, some team over in another BU that they just tell us to pull from this registry on Artifactory and run it. I'm like, well, what? it's a very cool, you need to work backwards and figure out who containerized your app. So that's the first question I always ask. The next one, why? Honestly, let's ask, why did we containerize this app? AsgharLabs containerized their app because they were told to. Not for any other reason than some exec needed to say that their core software stack was now next gen. I've seen this happen at multiple companies where now the CIOs are flying in airplanes again, they get that little magazine and they say, hey, Kubernetes is that next big thing. We should probably be running that thing. Why? Like, if there's no reason why you did this other than you were told to, you really should take some moments and ask, is it worth it to keep going down this path? And I'll talk more about that in a minute. The next question, where? Where did you deploy your app, or where are you planning on deploying your app? Who knows what an ELA is? Enterprise License Agreement. Raise your hand. Okay, there's enough people who don't. Good. Okay, so this is gonna make no sense to you until I say it. The spurs from the conversation is the cloud you are using because of a choice or in an ELA. An ELA is an Enterprise License Agreement, which means that you get free stuff. Like, it's like when you decide to go buy that piece of software from a company that makes office software without saying it out loud. And there's a word processor, there's a spreadsheet system inside of it. And if you didn't know, if you do buy it through them, they give you their cloud credits. Now, there's a lot of conversations out there, a lot of companies, they're like, well, everybody uses this to do writing our documents and all. Why don't we just put this up on their cloud? Well, if you don't know, if you're thinking of ML or AI in your moment right now, there's probably another cloud out there that immediately jumps into your brain. And if your company does ML and AI, you probably want to use that cloud, not the one that does your word processing and spreadsheets. But if you have an ELA with that company, your CIO is probably going to be like, hey, we've got all this free credit here. Why don't we put our software there? I've seen that happen way too often, right? Because it wasn't by choice. It was what they were told to use. You need to really take a moment and say, where are we planning on deploying this, or where have we deployed it? And it is the best one for your company or not. And CIOs really don't like that. This is my favorite one. What did we actually do? What did we actually containerize? This comes from the actual architecture of what you containerized. Now, how many people do Java development in here? A couple? Okay, if I say a WAR file or an ER file, does that mean something to you? Okay, cool. AsgharLabs took a WAR file, honestly, it could have been an ER file, and they thought they could just shove that into the Java Docker container and call it a day. That's what they thought their migration policy was. This opened up so many conversations with that airline that I'm not allowed to talk about that's a subsidiary of AsgharLabs. And it spurred actually the majority of this talk. Because you look at all the, anyway, I'll keep going for that. So let's look at some of the, if you notice I said the word architectural, the actual architecture which you containerized. So let's look at some of those architectural changes. And make sure you heard that word changes, because that's important. So the first thing is exactly what they did. And I work at IBM, so I have to have WebSphere somewhere. Thank you for laughing at that. Thank you so much. It's important. So what they did is exactly that. What they did is something called replatform. They had their legacy application, and of course they're running on DB2. They're not running on DB2. And they have IBM and Q, shove it into the Open Liberty container and run it on OpenShift. Yes, you should use OpenShift, don't use Kubernetes. And that's it, right? And a lot of companies actually stop right here because they're like, hey, that's it, that's all we need to do, let's walk away. But that doesn't, the reason why I had this conversation with them is that in this platform or this example, what they had done is every Tuesday, it was Tuesday, they had a 3-node cluster, right? For redundancy. It was all over data center spread across. And they were like, hey, JJ, can you come in and help us do auto node spin-ups? So they noticed that one of their nodes would spike at like 99% usage for the whole day of Tuesday. And they're like, oh, if we just spin up another node, we'll spin up another pod on there to be able to level load across so we can do twice the amount of work. And I asked him, like, oh, okay, cool, you're pretty advanced, that's pretty big. And I was like, okay, so why is it all just showing up on one node? The whole point is, Kubernetes load share across all your nodes with your spin out your jobs and all. And it turns out they basically treated it just like a VM, the pod. So when the Java containers spun out the scheduler, it would spin up everything inside of one node, if that makes sense. So instead of sending out like a bunch of pods for like batch jobs, so Kubernetes can schedule it across the whole cluster, it was all just showing up on one. And then that's where the conversation moving into repackaging into microservices, right? So now when you have a bunch of different services like that scheduler or whatever, some batch job you've got to do, if you can break them out into microservices, now you can leverage the cluster for all of what it is. And what am I saying? I'm telling you to re-architect your diagram because you can't do what you used to do. Not to mention also one of the core values of Kubernetes or OpenShift you should be using is the scheduler. That's what it is. All Kubernetes is an API to compute. You give it a container and it will find a place to run it. So leveraging it that way with 2 WAR files inside of an INIR file, all of a sudden now you're leveraging load across your whole cluster. But that's only just halfway there. Now you need to actually refactor into using the strangler pattern. So now that you've refactored your application to microservices, now you need to get them smaller and smaller and smaller of those microservices because you have some huge advantages, or honestly some disadvantages, but you have some huge advantages when you move down this path. Excuse me. So let's talk about the first one, which is, simply said, the advantage is velocity. The ability to focus on their own histories, scoping your clusters for what you actually need, is a huge velocity. There's cost savings involved, the ability to release when they need to be released because they're microservices, not big bang major releases anymore. And you'll be able to move as quickly as you need to for your product. But the disadvantage is this requires a higher level of cooperation. And you'll need to build out a brand new advanced, more integrated integration tests. And along that, most likely you're gonna need a completely different deployment system. Now when you release code, think of it just for a moment. Think of all the steps you have to do just to release that patch that you just merged into main, or you did a merge request or a PR to do that. Now think of it, I'm telling you, you're gonna have to scrap all that and try something completely different. That's kind of scary. So I didn't know this term wasn't industry standard when I wrote this talk. I used to work at a small company that started with a D and ended with an L that built computers. You might have heard of that one before. And we had this concept called the CCB. Most companies have these at enterprises. It's called a change control board. You know those random executives that have to sit in that room to say, yes, deploy that patch. Well, that change control board was, at the time, when I had to deal with this on a daily basis, or weekly basis, I guess, I was the production engineer, which is DevOps engineer, or SRE now, which actually ran the software. And I still remember, at this time, this was before COVID, and we actually went into an office. There was a small little room, quarter size of this one. There was a round table in there. They called it a huddle room. And they would they would have the director of QA, the director of development, the director of production, and the director of something else, and then the senior director of the actual org all sit in that room and go through each Jira ticket that they were going to release that weekend. The reason why this is important is that means everyone they said literally a thumbs up to that, yes, release this patch, meant I was waking up at 3 in the morning on Saturday to release a patch. So I paid a lot of attention to this. So needless to say, that's pretty slow, right? Like you imagine a bunch of really, really high paid executives sitting in a room, literally doing a thumbs up to say, yes, I approve this patch. Now look at it in the cloud native space. You could be deploying 10, 20, sometimes hundreds of times a day with microservices. they would never leave that room, right? Like they wouldn't. They would not be able to say yes. The idea of deploying all of a sudden becomes when you merge to main. Yes, do main development. Don't do feature branches, or do feature branches and merge into main. But you do the green button to say yes. So it's a huge change, especially with the enterprise space. But wait, hold on. Aren't we double lamping on things? Well, yes, of course you are. You're going to need to audit and verify that what you're doing actually isn't doubling up on your technology. A great example was AsgharLabs had both a scheduler inside their Java stack, and they weren't using Kubernetes, so they weren't leveraging the schedule properly, right? And there's another one. This company starts with an F and ends with a 5 that you might have heard of. And they have this great thing called a load balancer. It's one of the best in the industry, not gonna lie, it's really good. And if you have a bunch of co-located machines, you probably use a load balancer. Whoops. Well, if you didn't know, Kubernetes and OpenShift have a built-in load balancer. So all of a sudden, you could be using an extra hop there because you can do it all by software-defined stuff now. And that's a big change because that means all of a sudden your networking experts don't need to worry about that piece of hardware inside the data center. So you need to spend some time and really audit and verify what's going on. So you aren't doubling up on things. Isn't automation good here? JJ, why are things so complicated now? Well, first of all, very much so. With all the moving parts, you're gonna need to leverage automation and the computers to take the human error-prone parts out of the equation. You're going to have to rely on automation to do a lot of this work. When you hit that green button on GitHub, or is it green on GitLab? I don't remember. To merge that change, you're going to need something underneath it, and you're gonna need to build that pipeline. I'll get to that in a second. And honestly, your app has always been this complicated. You just haven't realized it. Who knows what an EA is, an enterprise architect? Yeah? They're the ones that know where all the skeletons are buried, right? And there's probably 2 of them. You probably spend way too much money on those people, mainly because they've been there for 15 fucking years. Well, now that you're moving into the cloud native space and you start seeing all the complexity, now you can actually start looking at that complexity and looking for those bottlenecks. With that visibility, you can start focusing on those optimizations. And when you truly get to microservices, you'll be amazed on the information you can get out of it and look for those optimizations. But again, it's a long process to get there. To quote a great friend of mine, do you know what a bull mastiff is, everyone? It's a dog. It's a really, really big dog. Well, not that big, but you know what I mean. He said this when I was walking through this talk with him. He's like, JJ, you're basically telling me you had a ornery bull mastiff, and now you have 13 yipping chihuahuas. You gotta feed them all. They're not gonna do what you want. You're gonna have to take them to the vet, all that jazz. But it's much easier to pick up a chihuahua and move them when you need them to go somewhere else compared to a bull mastiff. And it works. It's a really wonderful analogy of how moving to a monolith to microservices. Still got to care and feed them though, don't forget. But on the flip side, if something goes horribly wrong, just as Ken says this, he stole from someone else who stole from someone else, we replaced our monolith with microservices, and now every outage is like a murder mystery. It really does. It really does become a murder mystery. Take a moment and think about it. No longer, unless you've set up aggregated log monitoring and every log file is unique with every single service, you'll have to walk through each process to figure out what everything did when. This is one of the challenges of a lot of those microservice tutorials out there, like on Istio or whatever. They only give you like 5 microservices to like play around with to see, oh, this is how it works. In a real production environment, you could, this is not hyperbole, you could literally have thousands of microservices, right? Or you might already have thousands of microservices. And if you don't standardize on your logging then, looking at the stack trace on one job to a not stack trace, I can't think of the word, error or whatever, on the other one, it'll be a nightmare for your operations team because they'll have no way of doing it. Well, like being able to aggregate what happened when. This is so important, but it's true. And you'll become, your operations team, your SREs, will become detectives because they have to walk through everything. So the reason why like APMs are so important now. And if you can't afford Datadog or any of the other big ones out there, just starting with something like Jaeger really does give you real visibility into what's going on. Overhead, but it's always nice to have overhead and working instead of not working and losing money. So if you haven't really caught on to this yet, I've started leaning towards not so much as the actual technical problems, but there's a cultural shift that's going to have to happen when you move to cloud native, especially in an enterprise, especially at a larger organization, because it becomes more a human problem than a technical problem. I mentioned that CCB earlier, and that CCB became almost something like they did in the Phoenix project. Who's all read the Phoenix project? Yeah, you remember at the very beginning when they had no one show up to that meeting, but it happened every week? It happens, right? No one showed up, and if they didn't do it, they weren't engaged by it. By the way, everyone should read the Phoenix project. It will give you nightmares, but it's very important to read. Also, the audiobook's really good too. With moving to cloud native, you'll have to start allowing yourself for self-orchestration. Back to, again, building off of main, right? Or being able to hit that merge button and actually make those changes happen. You have to trust self-orchestration of rollouts and updates. You lean more and more on pipelines and collaboration to get the different widgets out there on the right in time. And like I said, you have to build that pipeline. Who all uses CI? Everybody's hand should be up. Jesus, come on. If you're not, go start working on CI tonight. Excuse me. Who uses CD? You're all lying. No one actually uses continuous delivery. No one does. Well, that's okay, right? We're still getting to that point. With this culture shift, you have to leverage CI and CD. You have to leverage standards and linting so you can always make sure there's a standard for your code, especially from the SRE standpoint. Imagine, like, something goes wrong at 3 in the morning. You have to look at that code. There's a cognitive overhead at 3 o'clock in the morning where, believe it or not, where that curly brace is, you can spend more time. If you can't read the code like a book, you're gonna spend time looking at that curly brace and be like, why is it there? Why is it not here? Because it's 3 in the morning, right? So you need to standardize on some linting so you don't argue about where that curly brace is. One reason why Go is so awesome is they have the Go format command built into it. So every single bit of Go code looks the exact same. Okay, fine, you might not get to use Go at your companies, maybe your Python. Well, then standardize on some pip something, or sorry, pep something, pep 8. Pep 8's easy, right? Everybody does pep 8. Standardize on pep 8, so then when you read your Python code, it all looks the same. You'd be amazed on how many times I have this talk with people who are not SREs or on this side of the border. That was actually Freudian in a lot of ways. And they all of a sudden realize that, oh, well, I didn't think about waking up at 3 in the morning and having to deal with something. Like, no, that's literally our jobs. Anyway, I get riled up when I think about it. The cognitive overhead of debugging is important, and leveraging just simple linting and standardization and pushing it through CI just to get that alone is important. So I realize I'm coming up on time here, so I'm going to start speeding up a little bit. One of the hardest things I saw to deal with was the actual collaboration between teams. They had some great propaganda about Scrum teams and tribes and whatnot, but people still wanted to do it the old way. And collaboration isn't status meetings. It's more than that. It's declaring shared contracts for jobs and responsibilities with constant communication between teams. Jira tickets can only get you so far. I'm sorry to tell you. Jira tickets can only get you so far. One of the most successful things I ever saw was an executive tried an experiment. And I want to call the name out of the company, but they won't let me, but I'm allowed to talk about the story. Every single sprint, they took one person from one of those tribes that took care of all each of those microservices and moved them to a different team. Now take a minute and think about that. Every 2 weeks, every team had a new person on their team. That means that first week was a nightmare, right? The first time they did that, because they had to write a getting started guide about all the different processes inside of it. But then that second sprint that came by, that new person could just read that document, make it a little bit better, and all of a sudden they're actually being functional in that next week. And it really did pay off over time, because new blood comes in because you got a bunch of new hires. You had a bunch of starting guides and understanding what each process did that was looked at every single 2 weeks. Everybody could be functional. Of course, you have to have buy-off from an executive, and it slows production down. But if you pay that up front, you'd be amazed on how quickly it happens. Of course, if you don't want to move, there's human problems with it and all that jazz, but it's true. But the core idea of new blood coming in every 2 weeks was radical and made huge leaps for this company. And that's real collaboration right there. Well, with everything, you got to talk about visibility and monitoring, because we're nerds and we love graphs. AsgharLabs thought they could just buy one product. I understand there's some companies downstairs. Hell, I think there's one right here. They probably say that you can only need to buy this one product to do it. That's a lie, right? Like it is. I'm not gonna, there's no point in me not saying it. I mean, unfortunately too, Nagios is not gonna cut it anymore, as much as you wanna run Nagios, or I just showed how old I really am. They've learned this the hard way. Sometimes you're gonna have to have multiple monitoring applications to have visibilities and portions for only parts of your team, the things your team cares about. As badly as you want a single pane of glass, it's unrealistic. There are too many moving parts out there. This is a huge cultural change, and some people are still dealing with this. Excuse me. Now, something us nerds usually forget to talk about is actually this stuff costs money. Like, we don't have unlimited budgets. And there's a whole other org inside of your business that is called accounting, and they care about this stuff. So with OpEx, now everything you can be paid by a credit card, right? You can sign up an IBM Cloud account with just a credit card. I can actually get you past that if you really wanted. And you can just buy a Kubernetes cluster and OpenShift cluster and run something production-like in about 2 hours. CFOs go back and forth on this constantly. Some love it because assuming your team can keep good hold of your spend, predictability can show predictability quickly and the cost of the projects, which is important to know. But on the flip side, CFOs can't depreciate hardware or the data center anymore. That's a huge problem in some circles. There's something called GAAP, at least in the US, which is generally accepted accounting principles, where accountants actually leverage the depreciation of the hardware that we use as operations people to balance other stuff inside the business. And if all of a sudden that disappears, there's actual problems on the tax level that you've got to pay attention to. Obviously, as nerds, we don't have to worry about this, but it's something you should talk to your management about. Because if you're moving into the cloud native space, it's going to be radically different for them on the back end, and they're going to have some really hard conversations. Yep. What do you mean all our support's on Stack Overflow? Well, yeah, it is. That's the problem. I mean, of course, there are companies out there that support professionally, like IBM and AWS and whatnot, but you're going to have to involve yourself in the different communities, so spend some time on Stack Overflow. So, ideally, masking all these corporations that I've had exposure to with AsgharLabs has helped highlight some of the consistent issues I've seen. The best thing I can do is first ask you, do you really need to? I mean, honestly, do you really need to move to the cloud native? I mean, obviously I make money doing it, but if your business is already making money, look at your next project, right? Don't try to migrate. If you're already in the black, you're gonna lose money migrating, so maybe look at your next project as a cloud native offering. Take a beat, look for optimizations and features. This will drive your teams crazy. This will drive your executives crazy. But the more you pay up front and really do the research on it and use the correct tool for the job, the better you'll get. Or to quote one of my best friends, Thomas Cade, you wouldn't use a saw when you needed a hammer or a hammer when you needed a saw, right? They both can do the same job. You're gonna look like an idiot if you're trying to saw with a hammer. I mean, you can still break that piece of wood in half. look like an idiot. And you can use a saw when you need to hammer in that nail. It's going to take you a while, but you can do it, and you look like an idiot. So be sure to use the right tool for the right job. Thank you.